Today we're diving into the hard part about doing the transmission swap, and that is getting the ECM set up and getting rid of the TCM, so stick around. This video is intended for educational purposes only. Improper tuning can cause catastrophic mechanical damage, and you should do your own research before attempting any changes like this to a vehicle. Attempt custom tuning at your own risk. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the garage. And it's been a busy weekend here, but there's not been any videos going out, and there's a couple reasons behind that. One of them is we're still waiting on that drive shaft. Should have shipped a day or two ago, so I'm hoping for it to show up any day now. And then whenever it does, we're going to have to swap out the pinion yoke because we're going from a 1415 AAM style U-joint to a 1350 Spicer in the rear. The front was already a 1355 AAM, though the existing one that I had on there was a 1350 with shims with a Sonex yoke, but we're going with a chromoly yoke, carbon fiber drive shaft, 3.4 inch, back into a Yukon 1350 yoke on the pinion. Big shout out to Yukon on that ordeal because they actually include two pinion yoke seals based on your rear end, so you have the correct seal. You can replace it whenever you do this job. And it's a pretty straightforward process of going in there, jacking the back into the truck, getting the drive shaft out. You want to measure your pre-tension on the yoke. So put a inch torque pound meter on there, get a reading on it, pull the nut off, put the new yoke on, run it down, and then you want to tighten that nut down, or that bolt down, nut technically, down until you are back to the original tension that you had on there. That should make sure that your crush collar is seated back down. Just a quick tip on that. But today we're here to talk about doing the ECM setup for the Turbo 400 swap. And I don't know if you can really tell, in the downtime, I got the seats installed with the harness bar. Of course, the harness bar was already in there, but I got the harnesses in. I got SFI 3-inch belts on the driver's side. Then I just put a couple 2-inch belts for a passenger over there in the odd chance that there's a passenger riding. Obviously, they're not going to be going down the track with us. And then we've got a lot more to do once the center console is done. Justin's buttoning that up for me right now, and we'll dive into wiring things. The motor has the intake manifold off right now because the Lingenfelter launch control was not working. Technically, half of it was not working. The portion where if you send a trigger to pull timing, that was working. I've got that tied back to the wideband failsafe gauge. Whenever that goes lean under boost, it pulls 15 degrees of timing. And you can actually see that it's represented as a misfire on the dash. So the check engine light will flash because literally the timing is out of sync and the ECM gets mad about that. But that's a good indication that that portion of it was working. Now the launch control, or the two-step portion of it, would not. And you can hold the button down, you can see the activation light come on, and there's different rates in which it flashes. It was flashing at the correct rate, but it wasn't doing anything. In the red light, the on power light, whenever you hit your set point flashes, that was also flashing also, but the RPMs would just go right past it. So, you know, that it's still under warranty. I boxed it up, shipped it in. I'm getting ready to put the motor back together in case the drive shaft shows up in the next day or two, that we can go out and do some tuning without the launch control on there. But I want to get that fixed because I do like the timing cut feature on it. And we are going to want the launch control feature on it so we can have consistent RPMs on launch. That, along with the trans brakes, is going to make this thing take off the line like a bat out of hell. Now, let me tell you something. This transmission is mind-blowing how much better it is than the 6-speed. And there's a couple reasons behind that. For one of it, it takes a lot less horsepower to drive a 3-speed. There's less internal parts in there that has to be spun by the motor, so you're losing less flywheel horsepower. By doing the swap, I have technically picked up real-world horsepower because of its ability to effectively get power through the transmission. Powerglide's even more efficient. If it takes 45 pounds or so to spin a TH400, it takes about 15 pounds to spin a Powerglide. I've not been able to find the numbers on how many horsepower it's going to take to spin the 6L80, but I can tell you it is at least probably 70 to 80 horsepower versus the 40 on this. And then we're going to be going over to a carbon fiber drive shaft from a steel one, which is going to lower that inertia also and is going to make this thing very rev happy. Right now, though, it is mind-blowing how quick this thing revs and how quick the revs fall off. the big complaint that everybody has is it takes forever for the revs to fall down on my car or my truck, and that's the 6L80. That's the transmission inertia having to be displaced. We're also running a little bit smaller of a torque converter on there, and because that all just helps. So it is really, really responsive, aggressive, and is just going to deliver a lot more power output compared to running that big 250-pound 6L80. Did I mention that we also shed about 100 pounds worth of total transmission weight? So all in all, in my personal opinion, this has probably been my second favorite modification I've ever done to the truck, right behind supercharging it. It has made a huge difference in how it drives. But we need to talk about the ECM side of things because it's a little bit wonky. Based on the generations that you would do transmission swaps, there was different avenues to do this stuff. In the 3rd gen, the segment swap was real big, and they carried that kind of over into the 4th gen. And the idea behind that is the operating system on your PCM or ECM was basically the same operating system that had different segments that were loaded into the operating system. And so what you would end up doing is saying, okay, here's the OS that I have on my controller for my automatics per se. I need to go out and find the same OS that had a manual installed in it, and then you could change those segments out on the transmission side of the operating system. And that carried over into the 4th gen for the most point. But we get into the 5th gen is a little bit weird, and that's because the operating systems are different for every single platform out there. So if you were to look at the service number or the part number on the ECM, that number may be the same for a 15 Silverado, Sierra, Suburban, Corvette, not Camaro because that was still an E38 back then, but there was a lot of cars, Cadillacs and stuff like that, that were using the same E92 ECM. But if you go in and look at them, all of them have different operating system numbers. But the interesting portion of it is if you have ever looked at a Silverado file, you'll notice that it has all the information in there for the supercharger, turbochargers for, the twin turbo Cadillac, or the single turbo 4 cylinders, or the supercharged LS9s, things like that. All of that information is in that operating system. Because of that, there's not really segments. What happens is the operating system itself seems to have flags enabled in the background to say whether or not these things are part of the application that's being downloaded into. And that's where we ran into trouble. There are no manual Silverados. This generation on 2014 and on, no manual Silverados. They did away with them. People say that they might have them in Mexico or Brazil or something like that. Nobody's been able to find a tune file for one of those to see what the difference is, to see whether or not you could actually do a segment swap. So instead of doing that, what we're going to do is look at how I went out and finally found a Corvette manual operating system, and I loaded it onto the ECM. Well, this doesn't necessarily work in previous generations. It does, but it will change the VIN number on the 4th generation if you do that. Whereas on this one, the VIN number is locked into a portion of the ECM that cannot be overwritten. That's part of the Global A platform. Whenever you go in and first configure a module in this thing, such as an ECM, it goes out and talks to the rest of the modules. It says, what is the VIN number for this vehicle? Which is also something that is put in through SPS as you're doing the module programming. And once everything aligns, it says, okay, burn this VIN number into this ECM. That's why you can't just go out and buy a used E92 on eBay and swap it in. It will not work because the VIN numbers will be a mismatch and the BCM will say that is not the proper unit. And sometimes it'll actually shut down and brick modules. So be aware of that. On the same note though, we do have the benefit that since the VIN number is burned into the ECM, we can change the operating system. Whenever we do a write and tire, we are replacing all of the data on there except for that VIN number that is held in its own section of memory that cannot be overwritten. So we can blow all this information out and put a Corvette tune into this vehicle and it'll still have the VIN number, everything will line up. Bear in mind, whenever you do that, you have to license the service number for the Corvette. So it's going to cost you $100 to be able to write that service number of that tune, even though you already have this thing unlocked. The cool thing about it is, though, you don't have to then reservice or re-unlock the tune. You load this one in, pull it out as a full read, and it will allow you to write it up because the VIN and the service numbers, though they were mismatched, you have credits, for that service number, and HP Tuners is fine with that. Now, why do we want to do this? The big thing about it is there is a bunch of tables. If you look at what we have available through HP Tuners, we have available maybe 10% at the most of everything that is going on inside a tune. There are just thousands upon thousands of parameters tables, enablers, things like that that are happening in the background that we do not have access to. They're not stuff that normally you would need access to, and so it's not things that the guys over at HP Tuners are going to hunt down and try and figure out. They look for the most important parameters in order for us to tune these vehicles. So all of the stuff that is on there that's happening in the background we don't have direct control over is the stuff that makes a difference whenever swapping over. So I know a lot of you are saying, well, if you go into the manual part of the tune, and in fact, let's just jump over to the screen so I can show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so I've got the tune that is literally loaded on there right now, and it is the Corvette manual tune that I loaded in there. But as I was saying, if you go over to the trans section, you will have this information. If you have the T43 TCM that's still part of the 6L80, there will be a lot more tabs underneath here. But the big thing to look at is there's an ECM trans type here, and if you mouse over that, you will see down below that this is actually an ECM parameter. Even though it's listed underneath the transmission table, that doesn't mean that it is a TCM parameter. And so everybody's like, well, oh, you can just change this over to manual. You can, but it's not going to solve a lot of your issues. There's some things that are going on in the background that we don't have control over that we need to address. Specifically, whenever I loaded the original tune-up with this switched over to manual, as soon as I turned the key on, the thing lost its mind and started throwing all the StabiliTrak and ABS errors, and that's because it is still expecting to get data from the TCM, and that is behind the scenes on the ECM telling the other modules, hey, I have an automatic transmission in here that I'm looking for this data. So we no longer had the TCM in there, and I know a lot of guys will just pull the TCM out of the transmission and jam it back in or plug it back in line and then hang it out of the way. You shouldn't have to do that, and you don't have to do that. So let's go back to an earlier version of this program. If we come in and look at Archive 27, and what we're looking at is to come underneath the calibration details and underneath the controllers, it'll list that we have both the T43 and the E92. And what I was looking in particularly at is the main operating system. I was looking for something that aligned with something else. If I open up a Corvette tune, in fact, we'll look at the one, and I made a mistake during this process. I'll tell you right away. I loaded up a Z06 tune and did not even realize it was a Z06 tune and flashed that in. It did not work. The throttle control was just dog because it is looking for different tables that were normally not enabled on this platform, looking for additional inputs, outputs, things like that. I didn't catch it until afterwards. I was like, why is the throttle response just not working? To the point where I would have it floored and the accelerator would be floored. Throttle body wouldn't go more than 14% open. Didn't matter. And it just wasn't trying to do anything. Well, that ties back to the fact I wasn't paying attention and loaded up a factory supercharged configuration. Went back, unfortunately, had to pay for 2 more credits to load up standard, the LT1 manual configuration. As soon as I did that, solved all of those problems. So keep that in mind if you're doing a process like this. But we'll come in here, we're gonna open up probably the Corvette tune that I used, and we will take a look at it. Where are you at? Where are you at, Corvette? And I think it was this one. We'll do calibration detail. Okay, so here's the Corvette tune. I went out and found a 2015 3LT Z51 with the LT1 in it, and same ordeal. I am looking at this main operating system number and I'm comparing it to the one that was in the truck. Well, something sticks out right away. If you look at these numbers, it's the first 4 digits, 1266. After that, you have 4769 on this one, then you have 1266, 5218. So it's an indication to me that the 1266 is the series or the version of the operating system for the 2015s. Now, there's some people that have done testing and proven that the 2014s do not work with the 2015s. There was an operating system revision in between the two, and maybe even the ECMs will not take the files. So keep that in mind that you're probably going to be stuck within the year model of your vehicle to find a calibration like this. But Going off the fact that both of them started with 12.6.6 told me that this is basically should be the same base operating system. And then the last 4 digits are going to be more of an indication of what is going on within the tune, how it is set up per vehicle. So I went ahead, licensed this tune, and loaded it up into the Silverado. And let me tell you, as soon as I did that, whenever I turned the key on, all the StabiliTrak errors went away. Gone, done, no issues there, because now the ECM is not looking for all that data from the TCM. Even though I had gone in and changed over the trans setting from auto to manual, it did not care. That didn't really make a difference. So keep that in mind. Now let's look at some of the other things that we had to do in order to get this set up. A big one is looking at the speedo section on here. We need to enable use rotational signal and disable the front wheel drive's probably disabled already, but OSS TOS would be enabled because that's the signal coming from the transmission. Disabled the OSS TOS, and then use rotational signal is the wheel speed sensors. The first time I took this thing out for a drive, it wasn't registering any speed. As soon as I made these changes though, now it registers speed perfectly fine on the dash and actually in the tuner. Now I know on some previous generations there's an issue whenever you do this segment swap or something like that, that the speedometer in the tuner or the scanner will show 158 miles an hour. I did not have that issue with this setup. Now that was basically it for this tune file. As far as the tune file went, as soon as I did that, everything else works. I've had to make some adjustments to the torque tables, things like that. But it doesn't care now because it's not necessarily looking for a gear input from the transmission. Even though those were provided by the transmissions, even the manual transmissions have a gear status going to the motor itself doesn't really care about that. So doing that has been working perfectly fine for this setup. Now, the wiring part of it, because there's some wiring that needs to be dived into, let's go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so I've got up the inline 16-way connector description. The thing about it is finding the wiring diagram for this is kind of a pain in the butt because this is not an in connector. It is literally, there is a harness inside the transmission that breaks out and goes to all the different electrical components, including the TCM, and then it has the round barrel connector that we're used to disconnecting and connecting off the TCM. Keep that in mind. The big thing that we want to look at though is the data communication on this thing, and we'll pull up the schematic and you'll see why. In this area over here, the TCM is right there at the end, right beside the ECM. The ECM is the last thing in the chain. It has the CAN bus resistor on there. So wherever the data link connector is on this thing, which is probably somewhere in the middle right here, and then it goes off one direction and the other direction, splits out. One end is going to be the BCM or the chassis module, then the other end is going to be the TCM. Well, we're removing the transmission TCM. Because of that, we have to bridge the connections. And you can see in here, it's pretty straightforward, that we're taking this out and just bridging 10 to 14 and 11 to 13 where that round connector was. And in fact, I cut mine off, spliced the wires together, and that completes the loop so that the ECM is back in the communications loop. Now, let me see here if we can... There's also one other thing that you want to take into consideration, and it doesn't seem to matter on the manual configuration, is that is the park neutral signal. There is a manual park neutral signal in the automatic transmission. It is a ground switch. Whenever you're in park or neutral on your shifter, it sends ground to the ECM to allow the ECM to start. Going over to the manual configuration disables that input. Even though it's still listed on the pinout for the Corvette, it doesn't seem to use that. I can start this thing in any gear, which is something I'm working on trying to find a solution. The issue being that I think is what happens is that the manual is set up to look at the clutch pedal position to see if the clutch is being depressed in order to allow you to start. Well, that shares the same setup as the brake position sensor. So whenever the brake is being pushed, it thinks that the clutch is being pushed. And honestly, I don't know that I've ever tried to start this thing without pushing the brake in. It may be that it won't start without the brake in, but what we could then do is wire that signal through our neutral safety switch on our shifter to say that that also has to be made along with the brake in order for this thing to start. So we'll talk about that in a future future video. This is the big things that I wanted to talk about on this video. As far as getting the ECM set up so we don't have any check engine lights, don't forget you're going to have to disable the U0101 DTC, which is TCM not connected or no longer communicating. And there's also a bunch of DTCs that you'll want to copy over from your original to the new one to make sure that you're running the original set of DTCs that you were on your setup. And specifically, if you've already deleted out like the secondary O2 sensors and stuff like that, the option of copying over the tune from one to the other using the comparison log does not work for the DTCs. For the rest of it though, it's very straightforward. We can come in here and open up our tune, and in this case we want to open up our Corvette tune and then do a comparison of our last tune that we had on our vehicle. And so I'm going to come back to the archive, grab this one, and then we can just come in here, go to our comparison log, and just copy over all differences. That way all of our injectors, our VE table scaling, all of that stuff is updated in the Corvette tune. You'll notice that the master DTC list pops back up. We have to go through that list manually and copy that stuff over. I'm not sure why that doesn't work, but as you scroll through here, you will find where they're different. And then if you click through them, they will go red whenever they are matching up, or actually they will go red without a box whenever they're matching up. And so you'll have to do that manually, go through all that stuff. And then as I said, the U0101 down here will probably not line up because on the transmission, it is already, or on the manual ECM, it is already disabled. And so we will want to keep that no error reported SES is unchecked. That way we're not getting that DTC for U0101. Okay, so that's pretty much it. It's not as complicated as it sounds, though it can be made complicated. Just keep in mind that you're looking at files that have the correct stuff on it. Don't do what I did and have to spend the extra $100 because I put a Z06 supercharged file in here. But it's just worked out better than I thought it would. I went into this mentality with the mentality of thinking, okay, there's a good chance this might break my ECM. How's the Gen 5 going to respond to writing a file or an operating system from a different tune or a different vehicle platform into it? Didn't seem to matter. Just make sure you're doing right all. Don't do right config whenever you do that first. When after that, then you can go back to your standard right config, things like that. So I'm sure some of you guys are going to have some questions on this stuff. So a little peek behind the curtain on how all this works together. And we're going to have future videos to talk about things like getting the neutral safety switch to work so we can't start this thing in gear. That's pretty important to me, even though most of you probably wouldn't worry about it. Then we also have to do things like get our smooth stage set up. We still got a lot of work before we can get this thing down the track, but we're trying to knock it out as soon as possible because we're running out of months out there. So I'm going to get back to it. You guys know the drill. Thanks for stopping by the garage. And remember, ABT, always be tuning.